Is Armenia's prime minister about to be ousted? The military wants him gone, but his supporters are standing by him on the streets. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Nicole Pashinyan. Well, since losing the war with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, Prime Minister Nicole Pashinyan has come under immense pressure inside Armenia. Opposition calls for him to step down started months ago, but today the Armenian military demanded his resignation. Pashinyan called it a coup attempt and immediately rallied his supporters to the streets. He's now fighting to stay in power, but should he?
Yes,
What is happening now, this statement from the General Staff, I consider it an attempt at a military coup. You know that I took all responsibility for what happened and tried to do everything to answer all the questions myself. Now we have come to a stage where we cannot avoid questions towards some of our high-ranking military personnel.
Okay, let's get some insight now. And Matthew Bryza, co-chair to the OSCE Minsk group formed to resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, joins us now from here in Istanbul. Matthew, thanks so much for being with us. You know, the pressure has been building for months, so should Nicole Pashinyan at least call an early election, if not just resign?
Well, a lot of people in Armenia think that. The president of Armenia, Armen Sarkisyan, in mid-November, right after the military defeat to Azerbaijan, called for exactly that. He called for early elections. But, you know, I don't think Pashinyan wants to resign. And I don't think he wants early elections because I think he worries he's lost so much support as a result of the second Nagorno-Karabakh war that he won't win. And, you know, being ousted or quitting power could be very hazardous to his health as well. I'm surprised he survived this long, though. You and I, Andrea, way back in late September when the war began, had a discussion about how long he could survive politically because clearly Russia did not like him and President Putin doesn't like him. Now, however, Putin sort of needs Pashinyan in place to make sure that the ceasefire agreement of November 10th can stay in place.
Right. The question now is, and I want to broaden this out a little bit too, I mean, what is the opposition actually offering as an alternative, and do you worry that a successor could actually prove more antagonistic toward Armenia's neighbors, particularly Azerbaijan and Turkey?
Oh, definitely. I mean, what basically the opposition is offering is to go back to the old ultra-corrupt political business system that is really what is responsible for Armenia losing the unwinnable war with Azerbaijan. It was that old regime that failed to invest properly in military modernization. And it's that old regime that maintained a crazy myth that Azerbaijanis don't know how to fight and Armenians can't be beaten on the battlefield. So it would be more of that. It would be more of the old myths, and I think a lot of anger about Azerbaijan and Turkey, and an unreadiness to face the reality that the war is over and it's time for Armenia to reintegrate itself into the regional economy, together with Turkey. Right.
That reality is apparently very difficult for Armenians to face because those calling for him to resign are genuinely angry about Armenia's perceived loss in Nagorno-Karabakh. But honestly, who could have done a better job? The international community had already declared that this was, part of Azerbaijan, and it was a matter of negotiations before it was really recognized and probably insisted that it be handed over diplomatically. So who could have done this better anyway?
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that nobody could have run the war better, I think, than Pashinyan, because Armenia had lost before the war began. Its Soviet or Russian-made weaponry was way outdated, and their tactics were simply static defense, sitting in trenches. Whereas the Azerbaijani side had modernized its tactics and its technologies with the help of Turkey and Turkey's drone technologies. So to me, the big problem with Pashinyan was he provoked this war. He's the one who publicly said in 2019, no more land for peace. Our policy, our new doctrine is new wars for new territory. So he provoked it. That was his big mistake. However, the people protesting him now in Armenia, that's not what they're saying. What they're criticizing him for is having signed what they call a capitulation at the end of the war. But he had no choice at that time. He should have never gone to war in the first place.
All right. Matthew Bryza, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, as always, so much for being with us.
Thanks, Andrea.
Now, the man immortalized in the Hollywood film Hotel Rwanda has led a remarkable life. Not only did Paul Rusesabagina survive the Rwandan genocide in 1994, he's also credited with saving more than 1,000 civilians from almost certain death. But almost 30 years later, Rusesabagina is in the midst of another battle, this time for his own freedom. He's on trial for a series of charges, including terrorism. In a moment, I'll speak to his daughter and ask what she makes of the case against her father. But first, here's Natalie Pohonen.
From Hollywood hero to handcuffs, Paul Rusesabagina was lauded for saving hundreds of people at a Kigali hotel he managed during the Rwandan genocide in 1994. His story was transformed into the Oscar-nominated movie Hotel Rwanda.
We have been abandoned. There will be no rescue. We can only save ourselves.
Rusesabagina was also awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Without that shelter, every one of them would almost surely have been killed during those weeks and months of merciless terror.
Now he himself is accused of terrorism, along with charges of forming an armed group and murder relating to 2 incidents on Rwandan soil in 2018. He was living in exile in the US at the time. He's on trial alongside 20 others who are accused of supporting the armed rebel group, the National Liberation Front, or FLN. Rusesabagina admitted in court last year that he did help form it, but never supported violence.
We formed the FLN as an armed wing, not as a terrorist group as the prosecution keeps saying. I do not deny that the FLN committed crimes, but my role was diplomacy.
Rusesabagina says the trial is politically motivated, and his lawyers have denied the charges against him. He's long been a critic of President Paul Kagame. He founded an opposition group overseas, the Rwanda Movement for Democratic Change. Its armed wing is the FLN. Rusesabagina says he was tricked into coming back to Rwanda.
I am here illegally because I was kidnapped when Rwanda opened a case in Belgium. I renounced my Rwandan nationality and I have to be judged elsewhere.
I would like to insist on the fact that he is in Rwanda illegally. He did not come following an extradition. He didn't even come of his own free will. He found himself in Rwanda against his will.
But will his arguments check out in court?
Let's cross now to Brussels and speak to Paul Rusesabagina's daughter, Karine Kanimba. Thank you so much for being with us. We know there are serious questions around how your father actually ended up in Kigali. That question alone could really render this entire trial illegal. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I first need to ask you why. When your father says he has no longer even Rwandan citizenship, did he get involved in funding an opposition group with an armed wing?
Those charges are invented, and this is not the first time that the Rwandan government tries to bring about false charges against my father. It's essentially since the Hotel Rwanda movie was released. Paul Kagame first offered my father a position within his government. My father refused and instead used his newly gained platform to bring attention to the human rights abuses going on in Rwanda being committed by the current government of Rwanda. And so for many years, the Rwandan government has been trying to charge him with different things, and it never worked because the evidence was never right, was never legitimate, and even now it didn't work, and they had to kidnap him in order to have a show trial.
Okay, but Karine, I mean, it was just a few years ago in a recorded speech. You can actually watch it on YouTube that your father pledged his full support to the FLN and an armed uprising.
Yes.
Why would he call for Rwandans to go to war knowing the tinderbox that persists in this region?
So So the attacks my father is being accused of, first off, we have evidence that these were led to false flags operations by the Rwandan government in order to smear my father because they had seen this video. However, my father has never asked, if you pay attention to the full content of the video, it's being taken out of context. He was asking people to stand up for their rights. And the Rwandan government has been twisting this over and over again to try to make him look like a terrorist. As a matter of fact, he has asked for an independent investigation, for a UN investigation into the attack, in order to find out whether, in order to prove that he's innocent. The Rwandan government has refused any independent investigation into these attacks, and as a matter of fact, the people, 2 or 3 of the journalists who first investigated on these attacks are now sitting in prison in Rwanda. So why does Rwanda not want these attacks investigated? It's because they're the ones who committed these attacks and wanted to pin them on my father.
Attacks versus, though, the issue of him actually calling for an armed uprising. That's what I'm asking about. He literally said the time has come for us to use any means possible to bring about change, as all political means have been tried and failed. It is a time to attempt our last resort. If that's not calling for an armed uprising, I don't know what is.
But if you look at the history of my father and the work that he has done over the years, he's always called for reconciliation, for peace, and for justice, and for democracy in Rwanda. And if you look at the situation in Rwanda today, people are disappearing, people are being killed, they're being kidnapped, like my father was kidnapped, just to silence them. So this is just for many years, he's been trying to call attention to these issues, and for many years the world has ignored these issues. It's just now that he had to be a victim of this government himself for the world to start paying attention to what is happening in Rwanda. But again, my father has always stood up for peace, and he's always wanted to bring Rwandans together to have a real democracy. And so now, essentially, this is an accumulation of many years of them trying to go after him, to try to silence him. And again, if they had any legitimate evidence about of him doing this, they would have used already established legal means to extradite him. The U.S. has extradited many people in Rwanda before. If they had evidence, they would have used legal means, not kidnapping. And this tells you that they don't even believe their own evidence, or the legitimacy of their own evidence.
What do you make of the fact that some analysts now say that actually you're trying to interfere with the judiciary in Rwanda, which is perhaps, ironically, more independent and objective than ever, especially considering, opposition figures Diane Rwigara and her mother saw all charges dismissed against them for inciting insurrection?
They were also illegally arrested. If you look at the number of people and the reason
but
Diane
they were acquitted
was in prison as well is because she was in opposition running for president. Right, but she had to be put in prison for false charges before that because she wanted to run for president.
I
agree. Anyone who dares to oppose or critic Paul Kagame is put in prison. And so this is a trend, and it's clear now in the world, and many reports have been released recently. If you read the Freedom House report, the Rwandan government has no problem going across international border to not only harass and kill critics. And so this is a continuation of all of this. And my father is also a victim of an international kidnapping.
Right. I agree. I agree with what you're saying there, that whether they were acquitted, but they had to spend, mother and daughter, almost a year in prison. I understand that. My question was what you make of the independence of the judiciary in Rwanda. Do you think there's at least a chance your father could get a fair trial?
Absolutely not. And as a matter of fact, my father has been denied access to his international lawyer. Why are they denying him access to his lawyers? The Rwandan other accused in Rwanda have had access to their international lawyers in the past. They've just changed the rules for my father. They have been confiscating. The one lawyer that he has access to is his Rwandan lawyer. They've refused all the other lawyers. And when he does go see him in prison, immediately after the Rwandan lawyer leaves, they confiscate his documents. Why are they confiscating his documents? And as a matter of fact, we know they're reading them, and these documents are privileged. They include his strategy of defense. And so how can you expect somebody to have a fair trial when he's not even allowed to keep his legal documents and to prepare for the trial confidentially in prison, as it should be? And another fact is he's also being denied his medication. So they're doing a lot of things to prevent him from having a fair trial. And as a matter of fact, the American Bar Association has released a really detailed report along with the Clooney Foundation explaining how every single one of his rights, including his rights as an accused, have been violated based on international law and Rwandan law. So this also speaks to the fact that they have no intention of having a fair trial.
Karine, I just want to get one last question in with you, and I'm going to bring it back actually to the beginning. I want to rephrase it in a different way. Why does your father want to be part of an opposition movement? He doesn't live in Rwanda anymore, but he obviously wants dramatic political change, and he has for some time. Why does he care so much about a country he no longer resides in?
The reason my father had to flee Rwanda in 1996 is because they tried to assassinate him. It's not because he doesn't love the country, it's because they have tried to kill him. And so for his life, he had to leave. And from being able, and while he still wanted to be able to bring about change in Rwanda, he still wanted to be able to make a difference in Rwanda, because the current dictatorship in Rwanda is killing his people, it's silencing journalists, and it's imprisoning people illegally. And so he needed to speak up against it. As I mentioned, for many years, he's used his platform to bring attention to these human rights violations, and nobody has been paying attention until now. And so anyone should be standing up against human rights abuses. We are all humans and all deserve to be treated with dignity. And this is not what the Rwandan government is doing, and this is exactly what he was trying to bring attention to.
Karine Kanimba, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We greatly appreciate it. Now, in 2017, Paul Kagame secured his third term in office with almost 100% of the vote. But many critics of the Rwandan president claim his landslide win is not down to his popularity and policies, rather his brutal repression of anyone who opposes him. For more, here's Natalie Pohonen again.
President Paul Kagame looms large over modern Rwanda. He led the rebel forces that brought an end to the genocide and is credited with bringing both stability and economic development. He's also, in effect, been the country's leader since 1994, but was first elected president in 2000. In the last election in 2017, he secured nearly 99% of the vote. He does have a high degree of popularity, but he also has his critics, who say there's little to no room for political dissent, either inside the country or beyond its borders. Rights groups have repeatedly raised allegations against the government of carrying out extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and deaths in custody. A Human Rights Watch report said the ruling Rwandan Patriotic Front continued to target those perceived as a threat to the government during 2020. A recent Freedom House report found Rwandans abroad experienced digital threats, spyware attacks, family intimidation and harassment, mobility controls, physical intimidation, assault, detention, rendition, and assassination. And that authorities take an extremely broad view of what constitutes dissent and seek to exert control over the totality of the diaspora. The Rwandan government has denied the allegations, but the trial of Paul Rusesabagina has brought both Kagame and his government back into the international spotlight.
Okay, let's bring in two new guests now. Joining us from Kigali, Phillip Clark is an international politics professor at SOAS University and author of How Rwanda Judged Its Genocide. And Gatete Ruhumuliza. He is a lawyer and senior fellow at the Institute of Policy Analysis and Research. That's a Rwandan think tank. Thanks both so much for being with us. Phillip Clark, I'm going to start with you, and I need to ask about the legality of this trial. No matter what Rwanda's president actually says, most agree Paul Rusesabagina did not return to Kigali voluntarily. There was no extradition order, so at best, he was tricked. At worst, this was illegal rendition. Can we even talk about a fair trial when the defendant was effectively kidnapped?
I think we can talk about a fair trial, Andrea, because in fact, that question of how Rusesabagina got to Kigali will be something that will be tested in the courtroom. And I think we know already that his defense team will try to challenge the legality of this trial on those grounds. But if the defense are going to go down that line, one of the difficult things that they're going to confront is that international law, in fact, is very murky on the question of rendition. And one of the consequences of the US, the UK and other governments in the past having used rendition as a tactic is that it has meant that international law is very vague on this issue. And so we're going to see the Rwandan courts tackle a very tricky international legal question about whether rendition is a reasonable tactic to use against a suspect who is based overseas.
And Phillip, I just need to be clear. You believe in the independence of the Rwandan judiciary. You do believe he can get a fair trial, that these judges can look at this case objectively.
I do believe that. And some of the organizations that Carine mentioned in her interview, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, and others, all predicted, for example, that Diane Rwigara, the presidential candidate, undoubtedly would be found guilty. That was their view, that you could not get a fair trial in Rwanda. And of course, it was right that you raised that example with Carine, because in fact, those organizations were wrong. The Rwigaras were acquitted in this very high profile, very, very important legal case. The Rwandan judiciary operates very separately from the Rwandan executive. It has displayed a high degree of independence over the last 10 years. One of the important features of the Rusesabagina case is that it's being broadcast live on Facebook as of tomorrow with English simultaneous translation. The doors of the courtrooms have been thrown open. The world will be able to watch this.
Okay. I think we've lost Phillip. I hope we can get him back, because it's very important to make the point, as well as Paul Rusesabagina's daughter was pointing out, and rightly so. Even though the defendants that Phillip Clark was talking about were acquitted, they were both thrown in prison for a year. They were harassed. They were traumatized. So, Gatete, let me put this to you. Paul Kagame was able to show, even if you don't break the law, and it's proven through an independent judiciary and you are acquitted, I will still be able to ruin your life if you challenge me.
Well, the court, what Phillip Clark was trying to talk about when he was interrupted, before I respond to your question, is the fact that Rusesabagina trial is being broadcasted worldwide. It's live on YouTube and on Facebook and on all social media. The reason they're doing this is because they want to show transparency on the one hand, but also accountability globally. For those who say that the trial is not going to be fair, and all these other questions that people are raising about how Rusesabagina was brought to Rwanda, what he did not do, all these things all these hearsay and people who are denying what he did are going to be tackled openly in court. The entire world is going to be there. We're going to have it in English translation that everybody sees. I believe it is of bad faith to preempt that a process is going to be unfair before the actual process happens.
Okay, but
that is dismissive and who arrested Rusesabagina and who is trying them are two different institutions that are independent one from another. Therefore, we should give it a chance and see how it's going to actually operate.
Understood. I want to address that question to Phillip as well, but Gatete, while I have you, I need you to explain to me why you feel Paul Rusesabagina deserves to be tried for terrorism.
Because he called for it himself. His daughter said that Rusesabagina has been speaking up about violence in Rwanda. I believe that apprehending Paul Rusesabagina is actually addressing terrorism, is addressing violence. Why? Because we heard about we heard from the daughter of Paul Rusesabagina, but there's another girl called Diane Mukeshimana. Her mother was killed by the FNL. We haven't heard from that young lady. She also deserves the right to have her parents were innocent. Paul Rusesabagina went on television. None of these questions were actually addressed by Karine when you asked them. But the father went on television and openly called for violence against the government of Rwanda. He said he formed an armed group only legitimate governments recognized by the UN have the right to form an armed group. No private individual have the right to form an armed group. The moment you do that, that's what constitutes an act of terrorism. And in fact, when you pose actions that take the lives, we have 9 people who died. We have hundreds of children conscripted into the forced army, forcefully recruited. We have arson, things looted, houses burned down. These actions, no private individual has the rights to do these things. And he did it, and he claimed responsibility and said, this is the only way left. I mean, you put all these questions to the daughter of Paul Rusesabagina, and she couldn't respond to them. But I think all these things are not activities that a private individual is allowed to.
Okay.
And once they have caused them, they have to be held accountable internationally.
Okay. We can see that you both at least do agree firmly on the independence of the judiciary. You both believe that Paul Rusesabagina can get a free trial in Rwanda. But Phillip, before I lost you, I needed to ask you, it's not about then what the judiciary has done. It's the fact that 2 innocent women who were acquitted entirely of the charges against them had to spend a year in prison, had to be harassed, traumatized. How is that just? You might have a fair judiciary, you think, but that shows that the executive branch is not fair and that it punishes political opponents.
I think Gatete makes a very important point, which is that there are different state institutions involved here. I mean, the concerns that you're raising are a question for the Rwandan police and for the Rwandan executive. The minute the Rwigara case got into the courtroom, we saw a high quality of justice delivered there and a verdict handed down that most international critics had not expected. In many respects, we're seeing the same process play out with Rusesabagina. There are justifiable questions about the way in which he's ended up in Kigali, but there is a danger of prejudging this trial before it has even taken place. I've seen the 300-page indictment against Rusesabagina, and it must be said that his daughter is incredibly selective in the pieces of evidence that she tries to criticize. She talks about the YouTube clips and words being taken out of context. The more difficult evidence in the Rusesabagina case are the wiretaps, the messages that he was sending to armed actors in the field, financial transfers that were made through Western Union and other agencies that show allegedly a direct link between Rusesabagina in Brussels and Texas and armed actors on the ground. This is more than just him going on YouTube and saying incendiary things. The prosecution is going to allege active participation, active financing of armed actions on the ground. Now, that is a much tougher legal issue for the defense to contend with. Now, I know why his daughter doesn't want to talk about those things, because that's much more damning evidence, and we will see that tested in the courtroom over the months to come.
Phillip, if I can ask you, as you know, as an observer, not being a Rwandan, but living in the country, knowing it intimately, just the fact that this was a man portrayed globally in a movie that so many millions of people had seen, that drew such inspiration from such heroic action, to now be hearing, and I know this was progressive over the years, but to now fully have this different picture exposed, that this man, they think, his opponents think, was far from a hero, but an actual terrorist murder they're accusing him. What does that mean for the country of Rwanda itself to have, you know, somewhat of a good picture drawn, and then to find out, hey, there may be no good guys at all?
Look, I think that's one of the important lessons out of this case, and I think it's a lesson that the international media has been very slow to learn. They've wanted to portray Rusesabagina as the hero of Hotel Rwanda, and to make that a strong enough case to say that it's implausible that he could have gotten involved with these armed groups in Eastern Congo and in Rwanda. The lesson of the Great Lakes, the lesson of this region over the last 20 or 30 years, is that individuals can play all sorts of different roles at different times. Right. Rusesabagina may have done some wonderfully brave things during the genocide in 1994. That does not inherently mean that he hasn't gone through some kind of political transformation that means that there are now these plausible criminal charges being brought against him in 2021. The history of this region says that it's entirely possible that may be the case. This is not about heroes and villains.
Gatete, your thoughts?
So first of all, one thing I want to compliment on the facts, on the facts that are going to be the indictment, the allegations that are written against Rusesabagina. would like to point out that the collection of this data, of this intelligence, of these facts against Rusesabagina, are not of the Rwandan security services only. This is the work of the FBI as well as the Belgian security organs, which searched his houses in Brussels and in the US, and these wiretappings happened in collaboration between the Rwandan police, Belgian police, and the FBI. So if people do not trust in the fairness of the Rwandan system, at least they will trust the fairness of the Belgian system or the FBI. So that's one point.
Gatete, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to let you get to the rest of that answer. We are over time, actually, for this edition of the Newsmakers. But thank you so much, both of our panelists, for joining us. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in as well. We'll see you next time.